Thank you, Katie. Hello, everyone. A real pleasure to be with you today. Thank you so much to the team at Woods Bagot for inviting me to be with you as we draw this year to a close. And I think for many of us, that's with a huge sigh of relief. But I guess we've all got to hold on to our hats, our heads, our stomachs, and everything else, because who knows what 2021 has got in store, huh? I don't think we're going to look forward to a year that's going to be any less exciting than 2020. Now, I've been asked to talk to you about post-COVID, and I'm kind of going to do that, but in some ways I can't, because we're too in the middle of this still to really think about a post-COVID era. We at the Future Laboratory have certainly been talking about the inter-COVID era. And whilst we may be getting steps closer to immunization and vaccination, I think it's going to take quite some time before we truly enter or re-enter an environment, a much changed environment where we can truly say that we're post-COVID. It's going to take quite a few months or even years before I think we reach that. So let's start to think about this in a little bit more depth. So I'm going to start to share my screen now and talk you through a presentation that I've been working on, that I've been discussing with the team at Woods Bagot, that I wanted to share with you, very much about this idea of change and really, the big question that we've all been asking ourselves. So what is it going to be like when we go back to normal? Well, I very much remember this question back in the days, the good old days of the GFC, where we worked with a lot of retailers, especially within the luxury remit and the luxury sector. And it was this idea of, so when's our customer going to go back to normal? And of course, they never went back to the old normal. They started to embrace a new normal, a different way of thinking about what their future might look like and feel like. And I think all of those of us that work within design, within architecture, within retail and property development, and also the workspace environment, are really critically aware of the dynamic shift that all of us have endured over the last year, and the way it's impacted on the way that we work and the way that we live and the way that we think about priority and the way that we think about space. And of course, live, work, space, and priority are all the building blocks for great architectural programming and planning. And all of those are issues that we as individuals are really questioning and beginning to think about when we look at how we're going to move forward. So let's start to look at this idea of beyond the new normal. In fact, what life might look like as we do move through what we've already called the transformative 20s, and more of that in a second. Well, as I've said, it's been an explosive year, and the coronavirus pandemic, without a doubt, and the subsequent events that we've seen that have been running throughout this year. Let's not forget Black Lives Matter, for example, which of course also has had a radical impact on the way we think about consumer behavior, the way we think about politics, the way we think about some of the bigger social issues that we're facing across the globe. But if we just think about coronavirus as a pandemic for a moment, of course, it's led to some of the greatest reevaluations that we've seen in modern periods in terms of thinking about consumerism. It's more than a decade for me. This is probably since World War II, the biggest thing that we've had to look at in terms of the seismic impact it's had on societies and the way we behave. Think about the 112-day lockdown that Victoria went through and the impact that's been having on retail, on hospitality, and on behavior. Not to mention, of course, for many people, mental health and the way that they view themselves in isolation or with other people and the way that they relate to other people. Now, certainly not since the financial crisis. Back, as I've said, the GFC of 2008-9 has our society undergone such a drastic reboot and seen, I think, such a major adjustment to the way that we think about spending, our priorities, and also our life goals. And it's these sorts of issues that I think underlie and underpin some of the bigger issues that are going on, because I think, as you've no doubt heard from many people over the last year, from forecasters and from commentators and from writers, much of what we've seen in terms of the change that has undergone, or that we've all been going through over the last 8 months, really was there before the coronavirus pandemic. And I think this is the critical issue. What we've seen is an acceleration or an exacerbation of key issues that consumers were going through. And of course, it's this foot on the pedal, this acceleration of issues around work-life balance, around remote working, around flexible working, that are some of the key issues that we're going to explore in this presentation. But as we begin to transition, I think, into the next phase of the COVID crisis, we are now beginning to get a glimpse of what the post-pandemic world could look like, and hopefully what it will look like. Because, of course, one of the big issues here is that we suddenly feel, once again, as individuals, as members of society, as citizens, as consumers too, that we're very much in the driving seat with this. This isn't just up to our political leaders to resolve. This is something that business leaders, but also individuals within a society, feel very much that they are now in a position where they are changing the way that they behave, and they want to see society change around them. So I'm going to talk about these three key issues. I want to address this notion of the decade that we're moving into, what we've called the Transformative Twenties. I want to talk about this idea of what it means to be part of a flexibility revolution, how we're seeing this speeding up of some of those key trends that were just bubbling away in the background over the last 5 to 10 years that suddenly are taking flight because of the opportunity that we've seen through COVID-19. And then I'm going to focus into not just on this idea of home, of work rather, and the workspace, but also the home space, and this combination of what happens when we really start to evaluate the differences we start to see in commercial, residential, and retail environments. Now, I'm sure we're all aware of the expression, the experience economy. It's been over 17 years now since this expression first came to the fore, and we started to look at this idea of what it means to be part of an experience economy, in which we saw people moving through or moving beyond the idea that acquisition was simply about product, but in fact it was often about engaging with an experience and engaging with a brand that was increasingly maybe online and was no longer that traditional definition of what a product was, something you could drop on your foot, but it was more conceptual, it was less tangible. You know, the whole idea of Apple was that it was about producing things like iTunes, which was something you couldn't drop on your foot, but it enabled you to have the soundtrack of your life wherever you went, courtesy of an iPod or later, of course, your iPhone. Spotify, another great example of a brand that we can all identify with, but you can't drop on your foot. And it's this relationship with the tangential, with the conceptual, with something that really impacts us in a different way that has seen the growth over the last 10 to 15 years of the experience economy. But as we move into the 2020s, what we're predicting is the growth of what we're calling the transformation economy. Because after a decade of expansion, we are beginning to contract, to regroup, and to refocus. And COVID-19 has been a catalyst for these changes that were already underway, thrusting consumers into situations that demand action, resilience, and ultimately, I think, a radical recalibration of society as we know it. So if you think that COVID-19 is the only obstacle that you're going to face in this decade, I'm afraid you are sadly mistaken. This is a transformative decade. Sometimes transformation is pretty, it's beautiful, it's lovely, it's optimistic, it's exciting, it's exhilarating. Whether that be the idea of the chrysalis and the butterfly, or the moody teenager suddenly becoming an adult with an awake mind that is understanding its position in the world. Well, we know it doesn't always work out that easily. And sometimes that transition is awkward, it's difficult, it's painful, it's aggressive, it's violent, it's difficult, it's depressing. And one of the biggest transitions, of course, we're going through is that as organizations, as businesses, we ourselves are transforming, because pretty much everyone that's watching this presentation right now is a product of the previous century. We were all born in the 20th century, and yet the world in which we are now operating is clearly part of the 21st. And just about now, you are starting to employ graduates and young trainees and young architects who, of course, have been born in this century. Whereas all of us pretty much watching haven't been born in this century. And so our mindset, the way that we think, the way that we evaluate, the way that we work is a product of a previous century. And that's one of the biggest transitions that we as individuals, as professionals, but also as people within an organization are going to have to go through, that maybe our method of working, our structure for working, our organization itself is no longer fit for purpose in the 21st century. That's a difficult thing to think about, but just think about those cogs and those gearings that maybe they're not quite as smooth and as easy as they used to be, because the organization is no longer geared up for 21st century thinking. Maybe it's hierarchical rather than being heterarchical. And so this radical recalibration of society, of the workplace, of the family is going on around us right now. And as citizens grapple with the environmental and the psychological impacts of consumerism, many of us are beginning to question our consumption habits. How many people do we have watching who had a rather sleepless night in Sydney last night because they just couldn't get to sleep because the air conditioning packed up? It just couldn't work to cope with that 25-degree heat at 4 o'clock in the morning. Is that normal? Is that the new normal? Is it going to be like that every day in summer now in Sydney from now on? Well, are consumers beginning to kick back against that idea that that's acceptable? And consumers are proactively seeking brands, businesses, services, as well as politicians that embrace new metrics of progress as we start to proactively look for the life and the transformation that we want to see in this decade, that we're thinking about personal well-being, emotional fulfillment, and social good over economic growth. We are proactively looking for the businesses, the brands, the products, and the services that are going to help us on our journey to become healthier, happier, and wealthier as human beings, as individuals. And the depth of this feeling is what's so critical, because when we certainly look to a younger generation and a younger youth population, sure, they're dealing with some pretty large problems and they're looking ahead, and maybe they're looking at a half cup, half full situation. But most of the research that we find seems to show us that the generation of Gen Z and younger are actually incredibly optimistic, they're entrepreneurial, they're activated, and they have expectations for great societal change. As an example, a recent report by Spotify found that 62% of Generation Z are ready to rebuild society from the ground up. Actively working against anxiety in these turbulent times, Generation Z are making their own paths and rejecting traditional systems. Can you afford, as a business, as a brand, to be rejected? Or are you part of the change? Are you part of the transition? Can you embrace the next generation of architecture, of design, of what your organization must look like in order to cope with the change that we're all going through? We've just obviously had one of the most momentous elections that the US has ever seen. More people voted in that election than ever before in the history of the US elections. And of course, our president-elect in the US won not just the Electoral College votes, that's now been confirmed, but also the popular vote. More people voted for Biden than any other candidate. And we now have a country that is also in a minority of those polled, looking at how capitalism is no longer fit for purpose in the US, and that actually socialism is the more viable means of success in the 21st century. Socialism in the United States of America. Some 35% of Americans believe we're not going back to normal. We're creating a new one. And this is part of the reality of the pandemic, igniting a greater sense, I think, of gratitude that we're learning to live happily with less. We're all now beginning to understand what it means to actually seek access over ownership. It's no longer about the product. It's no longer about the tangible owning. It's about the engagement. It's about the community. It's about the co-opting. It's about the sharing. It's about the leasing. And of course, those of us that work in community real estate have seen some of these shifts already begin to happen within the spaces that we're building and designing for our future communities. And as future customers, shareholders, and boardroom members, the entrepreneurial and philanthropic mindset of our Generation Z is outshaping outdated notions of capitalism, I think, far into the future. And whatever you're imagining for the future, it feels familiar and palatable. But the chances are that young people will reject it because their reality isn't ours yet. That's such an important message to understand and to take on board. Whatever you're imagining for the future, if it feels familiar and palatable, the chances are young people will reject it because their reality isn't ours yet. We may have been at the start of a curve, and a curve of innovation and great design and change 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40, or maybe even 50. But now that baton has been handed on to a new generation. and we need to give them the opportunity to create and imagine a future which may not be ours, which we may not feel comfortable with. So let's move on to the second area, this idea of flexibility and the flexibility revolution that we're now living through. Because having undergone this period of adversity, flexibility and resilience, I think, are front of mind as brands and consumers start to recalibrate and begin to adjust. There's so much that has changed within such a short period of time in terms of how we negotiate, how we buy, what we do with our time, the priorities that we have with as individuals, as families, as communities, as people within a working environment. And this process of adaptation and our ability to have an attitude that is highly adaptive is, of course, extending beyond the workplace as we reimagine our home and we reimagine our families and we reimagine our communities. So, as COVID-19 continues to make remote working the new normal for so many of us, businesses and companies, firms and organizations are having to find innovative ways to meet the needs of employees for and beyond the office. Now, according to WK Space and their recent research, 46% of employees believe that they will have more control over how and where they work in the future. And 53% think that work and the workplace will change significantly. And that change will continue, that we're not just going to go back to how things were as soon as we've had a vaccine, as soon as we've been immunized. That for many of us, this is a moment of enfranchisement, that suddenly we've been given the power and the opportunity to reshape our working lives, the nature of our day, how we program a day, that we no longer have to spend 40 minutes, an hour and a half on a daily commute, or maybe even longer, that we've got those hours back in our day to spend with our family, to go for a walk, to play with a dog, to shop when we choose, to take a longer lunch break, to actually manage our day so that we work when we're the most productive in our natural circadian rhythm, that we can appreciate how we work as an individual. And that sense of rethinking the office space is something, of course, that many businesses and many designers have been doing. Cuckoo's Nest, for example, describes itself as an Ofsted registered nursery with an integrated workspace. Now, Ofsted is the UK's non-governmental organization that manages and looks at school and education. And it's this idea of how we start to rethink our spaces as learning spaces, as relaxation spaces, as snooze spaces, that we suddenly rethink the relationship that we have with work and our working day, that we are a brand that allows parents to book both creche and desk time in tandem with our working day, that we rethink what flexibility really means when we build it from the bottom up for the employee rather than top down, thinking about some of those grace and favor elements that we may bestow on our employees, that little bit of space that we give to some books or a library or a chat space or a downtime space. But in fact, we really rethink what it means to maybe work in a hub where we only go to the main office once a week, or maybe only even once a month. And that sense of control that we now feel that we have as individuals is so important and is radically going to transform the way that we see work continue to evolve over the next decade. We're going to start seeing new living developments that tackle loneliness, neurodiversity, sustainability, and cultural issues in a bid to alleviate the pressures of modern living. Across the globe, the fastest growing household demographic is the single person household. Now, in some ways, of course, that's great. That's a move forward. That's about progress in the way that we rethink what the family unit actually means. But also, in a negative way, it's about isolationism, it's about silos, it's about not being with other people, it's about not having societies that meld, that bond, that collaborate. And yet, of course, we're also having to think about what some of the environmental and ecological issues are around the single person household and just how much space that takes up. Now, one of the things that we've all anticipated and seen as we come out of the coronavirus pandemic is how we deal with some of the mental health issues that have arisen to the fore as a result. And loneliness, it's very clear, is now absolutely a modern urban malaise. And recent figures in the UK, for example, from our Office for National Statistics, reveal that in 2016, 5% of adults in England reported feeling lonely often or always, whilst younger adults aged 16 to 24 reported feeling lonely more often than those in older age groups. And we start to see, I think, this hugely important issue when we look at some of the spaces that we find and the way that we think about how we address some of these issues and deal with them, both as designers and people who are ultimately responsible for the spaces that we live in as individuals, but also as members of that society. So we look at businesses and we look at designers like Core, incorporating shared spaces into its developments to inspire interaction between residents with a range of bedrooms incorporated into homes. Residents share open plan kitchens and living spaces, and each front door leads to the street below, an area preserved for residents and locals to inspire interaction, to think about how we create the social glue that binds societies together. And in countries such as India, this shift is particularly difficult for young single men who can often find themselves banned from housing complexes because they're perceived as not being traditional enough to live alongside families. And we have to start to break down some of those categories that have been created based on economics and social division to actually rethink how we bring societies together and communities together to live more successfully. And going back to that Indian example as a result and as a response, co-living spaces like OYO are tackling this at a local level by creating affordable housing schemes that tap into the forecasted $2.2 billion value of India's co-living market by 2022. So even in often highly traditional family-driven markets, we see this growth for singledom, for single household living, and for this idea of uncoupled living. Again, one of the big transformative shifts that we will continue to see over the next decade. And this isn't just, I think, about the individual space and about the individual family space. This is also about the way that we live as individuals within the commercial space and within our social spaces. So hospitality spaces are increasingly drawing inspiration from co-working and members clubs with hybrid offerings that mix work, play, and rest under one roof. Now, many of us in this sector for the last 5 years have been looking at how we start to reevaluate the traditional hotel or hospitality space, how we take the members club opportunity, and we start to rethink how we use space. We've all seen the growth, obviously, of the WeWork phenomenon and how that's changing the way that small companies and individuals, entrepreneurs often work. But increasingly, the move forward and the shift forward is how we're going to see our suburbs become populated with hub environments, with working hub environments, where people can come and congregate and work together and have leisure time together, whilst they may not work for the same business. They may not work for the same company. They're just congregating in their nearest hub because they no longer have to go to the headquarters. All they need is somewhere to work, where they have the professional services that they require, the meeting spaces they need, and all of the facilities that they may not have at home. And so we're seeing that idea of the continued growth of this philosophy through businesses like Birch Park Retreat, what they call an unmembers club and co-working space, or Rome, for example, which again started over 2 years ago. And this I thought was a fantastic business that suddenly now feels so right. It's a co-living, co-working community where citizens pay a single lease to stay in apartments across the world. And what this means is that you can take your team away for 2 weeks, 3 weeks to work on a project. You just don't have to do it in Melbourne in August. You could be in Bali, or you could be in another part of Indonesia, or you could be in Europe. You can actually move and understand that remote working is, of course, now not just something that was once a bit of a dream that we thought maybe we could try and do, but in fact, through the coronavirus pandemic has in fact become the new way that many of us see ourselves working moving forwards, as many businesses no longer want to see their employees back in the office until August of next year, or maybe even beyond that, maybe never. That we'll never, with some businesses, see that return to everyone and that kind of level of presenteeism that we used to experience within the office environment. So that sense of rethinking, how we rethink our space, how we rethink the environments in which we have, I think become hugely important. And we move into our next trend, this idea of the homebody economy and the homebody environment. And as we start, I think, to opt out of plans, and opting out itself becomes an act of solidarity, that ability that we have, the facility that we have to move through, to change our lives, to think about how we assess ourselves and our values within a society, as a citizen of the world, we start to look at the relevance that home has for us. Because if for so many of us, not just our professional lives, but our personal lives have been determined by our relationship with work, if work is being defined by our home environment, that changes our relationship with home. It changes our relationship, not just from a spatial sense, in terms of the requirements that we have, that the space must give us, the ability to work successfully in a space that's private, that's quiet, that's kid-free, that's partner-free, that is free from the other people that we share our home with, that has everything that we need in order to be able to do our job successfully and productively. We start to rethink our relationship with home and the pleasures that it brings us, the security it gives us, the sense of comfort and personal sense of self that we derive from being at home. Maybe it also allows for some of those guilty pleasures that we have, and that once we thought of as a guilty pleasure, in fact, becoming an act of self-care. And we start to look at the tools that we need that enable us to be able to switch off from the outside world. And increasingly, as maybe the environment of the outside world becomes more hostile, becomes hotter, becomes colder, becomes wetter, it actually becomes not always such a nice place to be. That home and the environment, the protected environment that we have there, that can be virus-free, that can be controlled, that can be exactly the way that we want to. We start to put more and more emphasis on the home life that we have. And I think the extended periods of time that we've had at home has forced many of us to rethink how we use our homes as spaces for working, for relaxing, and also for exercising. And the sense of embracing the homebody status is something that I want you to think about. This is not going to go away. Again, this was an underlying trend that we saw pre-COVID. We'd already started to see how, in the US, for example, with consumers under the age of 35, they were socializing at home. They weren't going to bars to socializing, they were socializing at home because their primary medium and format for socializing was digital. It was the online format. It was through apps, it was through multiple player games, it was environments where they actually congregated online rather than in the traditional bar or pub or restaurant. And so that sense of how we need to evolve our physical spaces becomes hugely important. At-home wellness, of course, has mushroomed amid COVID-19, powered by streaming platforms and keep fit regimes and the immersive equipment that has elevated our living spaces into hives of activity. And globally, the online sales of weight training equipment rose by 307% due to the mass closures of gyms and fitness centers. And Peloton, the at-home bike riding service that links you up to other cyclists, their global membership base hit 3.1 million at the end of June, which was more than double a year earlier as gym closures due to COVID-19 increased the demand for at-home workouts. And so that sense of the magic mirror that helped to train us, the environment, the ritual, the regimen, the space required, all of these increasingly important. And according to new research from McKinsey & Co., more than 70% of US consumers say they will continue with homely habits adopted during the pandemic, including at-home fitness, streamed entertainment, and self-care practices once the pandemic is over. That recalibration, that rethinking of our centers of importance, that home is no longer somewhere we only go when there's nowhere else to go. Home becomes the center, the start, the beginning, the middle, and the end of what we see as what's important to us. And this rethinking of the security and the comfort and the solace, but also the strength that we get from our homes, I think is something that we really need to pay attention to in the months and the years to come. And with the home playing a renewed role in the way that we eat and entertain, hospitality concepts, of course, are elevating the experience and the enjoyment of dining at home. We've all started to rethink what it means to to cook, to eat, to enjoy, to take out, to have delivered, to the value that we place on eating as ritual, eating as comfort, eating as socialization. And so we've seen the growth of home delivery services, food boxes, experiential dining kits containing everything we need for a great evening, ingredients, decor, playlists to recreate a global dining experience at home, supper clubs that suddenly come to us and actually deliver us the intimacy of a home-cooked meal, but prepared for us by other people. And this sense of new luxuries, new engagements, and new comforts, again, something hugely important to consider, because now not only do homes represent a remote working world, but the homebody renaissance means that they've also become a new realm for customer experience. IKEA, for example, is encouraging customers to use their homes for cultural escapes with its Vacation in a Box initiative. And Bleach London has launched a virtual hair salon experience to help guide consumers through at-home hair maintenance. Now, of course, some of these ideas feel like they're going to be here and then gone because, well, we'll all soon be able to go back to the salon. We'll go back to the bars. We'll go back to the restaurants. But trust me when I say that unfortunately, the coronavirus pandemic was just the first in a series of globe-stopping events that will happen throughout this decade, that will keep us at home, that will prevent us from going out, that will stop the type of engagement that defined the 20th century. We cannot believe and we cannot consider that the coronavirus pandemic is something that has happened to us in isolation. I'm not saying necessarily there's going to be another virus, but there will be other unceaseless interruptions that change the pattern of life as we know it, that we had come to expect, that determined that safe and secure way of thinking that was very late 20th century. We're in a decade of change. We're in a decade of transformation. Some of it's going to be hugely exciting and positive and world-changing in a way that will be exhilarating and exciting and open up opportunities that we could never have dreamt of. Some of us is going to take us to the limit of our resistance, our resilience, and our ability to perform. It's up to us as designers and architects to be part of that journey of transformation, to build the future, to design the future with one eye on the present, but one eye on the future as well, to dream with our eyes wide open. Thank you very much.
Wow. Chris, that was amazing. Thank you so much. So many nuggets in there to unpack. I'm sure the comments will start flooding in. I'm going to start us off with a couple questions, and then I'm sure there'll be many more. One of the things that you talked a little bit about and reading some of your work with the Future Laboratory is about recuperative living and how you're talking about consumers' collective concerns about hygiene, well-being, and immunity, and how that is going to drive new directions in beauty and wellness, which are focused on digital rehabilitation. That term is really interesting. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that means and maybe even how it might apply to certain sectors, say retail or hospitality or something along those lines?
Absolutely. Well, let's start with this expression, phygital. Now, this was actually a word that we coined, that we created over a decade ago now, when we clearly saw this shift, this dynamic shift from the experience economy, this idea of this transition that everything was based on product to experience, and this move towards transformation. And it really went hand in hand, of course, with the discrepancy that many retailers felt between online and offline shopping, and that this was about a collision. Rather than seeing it as an opportunity to profoundly deepen a customer's relationship with product and with experience and with brand, for many retailers, this was a fight. It was a fight to the death. You know, think about Harvey Norman, the way he stood up and shouted and berated the idea of online retail, and it was taking taxes away from Australia, good old Australian retailers who frankly just couldn't keep up with the competition. And so phygital is very much this definition of the physical and the digital. What happens when you don't set the two against each other in opposition, but you bring the two together? Because all the research has shown that the consumer who actually is phygital in their outlook, that they're actually using their mobile phone when they go shopping, and that the retailer is giving them an experience that sits on their phone, sits on their laptop, as well as sits in a store, is so much more engaging, and it's a much deeper relationship. And so we actually get more involved with the brand. So phygital defines that physical and digital experience and what happens when the two are uniquely combined. And that, I think, is a hugely important thing to consider. And it doesn't just have to belong to retailers. I think it is about anyone that's involved in brand experience, and also the 3- and 4-dimensional space in which we operate through time. And that's hugely important. Now, for us, recuperative living, Katy, starts to tap into, of course, the continued growth that we see with the 21st century consumer for an interest in wellness, that we no longer really focus on illness. Even despite, I think, the coronavirus pandemic, most of us have actually thinking about throughout it how we stay well. Right. And how we keep well. And we've been doing things to make us feel better as individuals. And that's about whole body health. It's quite holistic. We've been through, I think, those changes that we've seen recently where fitness has often been quite dynamic and it's been quite hardcore. We've seen obviously the growth of yoga and Pilates and other techniques that are about a more holistic understanding of body. And of course, wellness and mindfulness are words that are no strangers to any of us here. And it's this continued growth of how we also see this notion of wellness start to, I think, coincide with the notion of transformation. That, as I've said, we're on this journey to proactively think about our better selves, that we're not just looking for shopping opportunities that make us feel happy in this very transient kind of way because we've bought a new Gucci bag. We're thinking about how we consume services and products that actually make us feel that we've become a better person, that are about self-improvement. Maybe that's physical, maybe it's dietary, maybe it's mental, whatever it might be. But this recuperative journey, I think, about how all of these attributes come together is massively important. And it's this collision of these often disparate ideas of the medical, the wellness, the fitness, the mindfulness, all coalescing, that becomes very, very interesting.
Absolutely. In relation to that, as we talk about, feeling good and happiness, another one that of your microtrends is around the pleasure revolution. And you spoke a little bit about this in regards to the home body and kind of bringing a lot of that home. But, yep, you mentioned the cult of busyness and relentless productivity and that shift of focus on just pure enjoyment. And I'm wondering what we can do as architects and designers to help create experiences that support happiness and joy. I mean, it is like our ultimate being is to want, optimistic profession in general is to do better and make everything better.
Yeah.
But making happiness and joy is a really interesting idea from your perspective. We'd love to hear about it.
It is. Do you know what? That's so interesting. What you've touched on there is a topic I first started researching and writing about over 23 years ago, looking at neurotic architecture, buildings that actually could anticipate the human beings that were inside them. And we're beginning to see this now, the idea that the building can pick up on our neuroses, which is that buildings can anticipate whether we're happy or sad, whether our mood needs elevating, whether actually the building can change the lighting of the room that we're in to make us more wakeful, make us more focused, make us concentrate better, or to calm us down. We've now got supermarkets in the UK that have special shopping hours where they turn down all the lights for people who sit on the spectrum, and actually their neurodiversity means that they find the bright lights in the supermarket just way too hectic and they can't shop. So the idea that we become more open-minded about the way that we just simply light our spaces, to become more respectful of the diversity of human experience and human engagement, that we allow our buildings to become responsive, that we talk about bioarchitecture, biodynamic architecture, that we start to create buildings that look at how organisms behave, and that we use the same modeling, and that we use the same opportunity that we see in biology. All of these issues, I think, increasingly are becoming so much more relevant as we start to think about the future possibilities for design and the spaces that we start to create. Because this notion that you touched on in one of the trends we've been looking at, called the pleasure revolution, again, is looking at one of the transformations that we believe we're going to see over the next 10 years, is this focus on self moves from being very self-ish to becoming quite selfless. And it's the shift really in terms of the way that we define pleasure, that pleasure is no longer really defined by this idea of sensorial pleasure that purely is about touching the pleasure zones in our body, whatever those might be, that stimulate pleasure and make us feel happy and satisfied. But you start to look at what's called often eudaimonics, which is that you understand that actually you get pleasure from your ability to provide wellness and security within a society. So this shift, I think, from this idea that our focus on pleasure is very much centered on this sense of sensorial receptiveness towards this understanding of group ergonomics, I think, becomes also something that we see more and more of. And it's this shift towards the eudaimonic model that I find really, really fascinating.
A little bit as if everybody's okay, then therefore I'm sort of okay. You know,
it's just, again, this broader understanding of what it means to be part of a society in whatever shape or form that might be.
I'm going to shift a little bit to, you talked about the flexibility revolution, which talked about kind of a decentralized model for potentially the workplace. It's been something we've been talking about for a while, the hubs, the idea that you could have a co-working space right there in your local strip mall for, you know, that it's just as you go to get something at the shops, you can also go to work, which begs the question, I think, for us in terms of our workplace clients, you know, is the headquarters campus a thing of the past? Is it really dead? And if everything is going to move towards a co-working future, how does a company continue to have an identifiable culture, which I think they so hugely pride themselves on? And that's, I think you talked about it. Yeah, that's basically the question. What does it mean for culture of a business?
It's such a good question, and I think you've touched on a couple of words there that hopefully should help us to think about potentially what this future might be. I'm going to assume that pretty much everyone here today is a graduate. Now, some of us had a great college or university education. Maybe for some of us it was a bit, it was okay. But for a lot of us, it's a hugely important and formative part of our career, but also of our life journey. And we carry, as an alumni, I think often, this sense of community and this sense of engagement and belonging that we get from the university that we went to. And we carry that with us in some shape or form for the rest of our lives. And those of us that are lucky enough to maybe have found a community, a group of people with like-minded activities that we engaged with maybe in our late teens and into our early 20s, again, had cemented an attitude and an experience that we know those relationships that we formed at that period of time stay with us for the rest of our lives. There's nothing to say that life-changing cultural moment can happen when we join a new business, when we start within a new family of like-minded professionals. And that the culture that we create and that we inculcate into our workforce isn't something that has to be done on a daily basis because we're in the space. But yeah, we create that culture, we spend time, we immerse ourselves in that culture, and then maybe we go off. And we can still have that sense of culture when we're working remotely. You know, I still feel very attached to the college that I went to, and I have very happy memories of it. And I still carry that culture with me. And I think we've all been slightly worried that because we've all been so spread out, that this culture is going to dissipate and that we're going to lose it, and inertia will begin to creep in. There's no reason why we can't bring people back onto campus. you know, for a little top up, that we come together for working groups and opportunities where we meet. But do we need to actually be in that space on a daily basis in order to feel the culture? I think many of us might argue that actually the reverse, that we're going to appreciate the culture a whole lot more when maybe we only experience it once a week, once a month, a couple of times a year, once a quarter, who knows? So I think we'll start to get the measure of this. And it will, of course, depend on the company itself and the type of business that it is and the type of workforce that it has. And each business sector is going to respond slightly differently and have very different needs. I have several friends who work for American banks. They were required to work in office throughout lockdown, regardless of what government said. They didn't have a choice. You know, they were told that they had to get their asses in and be behind that desk. That was their culture.
Right.
Katy, we might take some questions from the room as I roam around the world with my virtual microphone. And Chris, where have you been all our lives? You're like our digital equivalents. Yeah, you even use our own terminology, citizens of the world, which I colloquially call as cows. Everyone in Woodsbagger is a cow of some sort. One of the questions from Sarah Kay in Sydney is, what are your predictions around travel and what will happen with that industry and the modes of communication as you work in a global company in relation to us operating in a global company?
Very good question. Thank you. Was that Katy in Sydney? Was that another Katy?
It was Sarah Kay.
Sarah Kay.
Sorry, Sarah. Sorry, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah, for that question. Oh, yeah. I mean, travel, lots going on. I don't know about you, but lockdown was the longest I have stayed in one place for 20 years without moving.
Yeah, very similar.
So I learned a lot during lockdown about what the velocity of my world and the velocity of the way I move through the world. And there's bits of that I don't miss at all. There's bits of that travel that I don't believe is going to return ever. I come and work in Australia. I have an office in Melbourne. I will be coming back. I don't think I'll be able to come back in February as an example. And so far, we're scheduled to do all of our presentations remotely next year. But I can't wait to come back. I've already booked three European holidays. So has the pandemic changed my attitude towards travel? Yes and no. I think many of us who have the luxury of being able to travel are reassessing the reasons why we do it and what makes it so important. And I think we will maybe travel in slightly different ways. We may take longer to travel. I've just booked a trip where I now have finally realized that I can actually go and work in another European city for 3 weeks. So I've booked a trip where it's not actually a holiday. I'm going to stay in a European city that I've always wanted to spend time in, and I'm going to stay there for 3 weeks, but I'm going to work from that city every day. So I think the way in which we move around is going to change, but I would say that the biggest impact on our travel sensibility is actually not COVID-19. It's the ongoing environmental impact that travel has. And it's the two trends that, of course, are diametrically opposed, which is the huge global growth of travel as we see the development of a massive global middle class across our developing economies, who all want to do what we've been doing as an economy for the last 100 years, which is get out there and see it and experience it. And then our other economies that are beginning to think about the sustainability that sits within the travel equation. And these two issues, you know, kind of are going to continue to dominate travel, regardless, I think, of what happens in the short term with the coronavirus pandemic. You know, a lot of our travel companies, our airlines have deep pockets. They'll still be here. They're resizing. Some will go out of business. The fittest will survive. That's the case with any of these kind of things. And the ones that are really good at what they do will still be here in 2 years' time. And, you know, I'm sure I will see a lot of you traveling back again very, very soon. So I think we have to think about, especially with travel, about the bigger, broader picture and keep focused on those longer term 10-year trends rather than the dip that has been caused by SARS, by MERS, by the coronavirus pandemic, as serious as it is. The issues around travel, I think, are are much more sustained than that. And that's what you need to bear in mind when you start to think about it in any depth.
And there's an existential question from our resident DJ in Melbourne, Dr. Joe. She would like to know, as we shift from a form of current capitalism, 20th century, and work, or ponos as it comes from, because work meant pain, so capitalism and pain, and we move towards a new form of socialism and pleasure, what is the role of governance and bureaucracy in that transformation? Or are they no longer relevant as we shift from one status, 20th century? And whilst it's great that Joe Biden is in power, he isn't 70 years old. And when do governments, or can governments shift to your proposed direction?
Well, that's a great question, isn't it? And of course, I think what were the Nick? What were the two words you looked at there at the beginning? Governance and
bureaucracy.
Bureaucracy.
Bureaucracy. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think governance is really interesting, obviously, because self-governance is, I think, a hugely important part of this process, which is allowing people to, and a heterarchic structure becomes really important at this point, because if we become more flat and more networked and more heterarchic rather than hierarchic, that process of governance means that we start to actually self-manage and self-govern as a group, as a community, as a network. So that becomes very interesting. And by its nature, I think heterarchies are less bureaucratic than systemic hierarchies that often tend to obviously to be layered. And a lot of the point is to actually stymie movement and to make things slower by layering and creating layers of authority and layers of autonomy and layers of responsibility. So the moment that we actually collapse those systems, I think we see some very interesting new changes happen. But great network and also highly structured and highly self-governing, which can actually also be quite brutal. So I don't think we necessarily need to think that this is about freedom or liberation, that this is about being part of a change that is untethered, or where there are no rules, or where there is no stricture or no control. I think quite possibly the reverse, because often, as we know, the dictatorship of the many can actually often very quickly create a level of enforcement of behavior, of what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable. We saw that during COVID, for example. Certainly in Europe, if you weren't out on your street, on your doorstep, on NHS night, banging your saucepan or clapping or whatever to show your thanks and praise for the NHS, you'd be getting calls from the neighbourship police. Well, where were you? Why weren't you on your doorstep? Congratulating and supporting our NHS. And so that sense, I think, of governance becomes very important, because it's a great thing, but let's not imagine that it's always something that we're going to enjoy.
Katy, James Calder from Everywhere and our Era Consulting business is speculating the future of office buildings, and should the owners of those buildings be worried, and what are your predictions around transformative uses of these in a huge part of our built environment? Given your advocacy for home, given your advocacy of home, how do you think?
You're only going a couple days a week. Why do you have this all this space?
What are you going to do with all this space? Well, look, I think we only have to look at the share price of some of our largest landlords across developed economies to know that this is a market that is going through an inflection point, where change has been brought upon them in so suddenly in what is often an extremely slow-moving and conservative business sector. So it's going to be a very interesting 18 months. Interestingly, of course, I walk through the City of London when I'm in London to get to work with my dog. And there is as much building going on in the City Square Mile, our CBD, as there was 18 months ago, if not more. But we know those projects are 5, 10, 15 years in the planning. is it just a question of it's not quite just a hardware software question? What do we do with the inside of the building? Is it worth it building those CBD buildings, those skyscrapers? I think we really begin to question, and we're going to need a longer period of analysis, I think. I think it would be very easy to give a very quick answer and say, oh, the future's over for the skyscraper. The future's over for the central, for the CBD across the world. You cannot be so black and white. This is an issue that, as I've said, is going to take years to work its way through. We've had a real concentration of speed around this idea of what it means to not work in the office, to suddenly unshackle ourselves from a daily commute that sees thousands of people congregate in tiny parts of our globe, that allows people to work in a different way. It's going to take months for businesses to start to actually work out what their policy is moving forward. So there are no quick fixes here, and nor are there quick answers. What we're going to have to do as the creatives, as part of this process, is try and build flexibility into our process as much as possible. The allowance for flexibility, the allowance for change, and the allowance for newness and innovation to come in, I think will be hugely important. Cities drive difference, and cities drive the development of our cultures. We're not going to see a point at which everyone moves to the burbs. It's not going to happen. We don't all want to live in Donvale. We don't all want to live, in the outer suburbs. We choose to live often in the cities because of everything that they can offer us and they give us. It's not just the stricture of work and the need to be close to an office. So the balance that will start to occur between the quality of life, I think, becomes hugely important. And of course, as we saw in Melbourne, I was involved with a project 15 years ago to help bring successful retail back into the CBD of Melbourne at a time when we saw people move back into the centre of Melbourne. Yeah. You've got to remember, 20 years ago, the number of people living in the centre of Melbourne was in the few thousands. I think I'm correct in saying it was less than 10,000.
It was when postcode 3000 first started some 20 years ago, Chris. Yeah, it was under thousands, and during that period, it's just the numbers have increased to hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, and it's that sense of where we find meaning in what that urban life means, that cosmopolitan environment, and the pleasure that it can bring to be in close proximity to people, to services, to culture, to sport. To everything that makes our life meaningful, and so I think our challenge is going to be how we repurpose what we've got, and how we take the long view about what we're designing for.
Katy, we've come to the end of a fascinating hour, and I'm always exhilarated when I find a kindred soul. It's like reading this book that unlocks a sentence that unlocks everything that Woods Bagot are doing. We're not alone. It's totally, today was totally amazing. And Chris, I found it more optimistic than pessimistic in terms of this revolution of the 20s. It's now for us to really take that and take it with full force and help the transformation. Thank you, Katy. I'm not sure if you've got any.
No, that's it. Chris, thank you so much for being our keynote speaker and futurist for our Forward Festival 2020.
Come on, let's go do this, team. We're not alone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.